To call you Dr. Nock or Matthew or
Matt is fine.
Matt.
Matt.
Okay, thank you.
I've been called much worse.
Okay. Okay. Now my name is Jan.
Jan.
David.
Are we all going to be?
Yeah.
Talking the discussion.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a team.
So
this is my stronger side.
I see it.
They're both weak. I know. My wife says I have a face for radio.
You have a face for radio.
For radio, yes.
So does your mentoring of students include the humor? Because Joe Franklin was also really great.
Yes, but yeah, yeah. We practice with them. A little improv.
So we just returned from Washington, and you've been there at the AAS.
Yes.
Please, David, join me.
Sure. Yeah.
My English is not that good. What was your impression on the lines of thought at the AAS? Did you witness anything new, or see something emerging, or see something declining?
It's a great question. I saw a number of things that give me excitement for our field. In the years I've been working in this area for maybe 20 or so years, the thing I take away and get excited about every year is the increasing number of people involved, at least in the scientific process. Just really amazing to see. When I was starting out in this field, there weren't so many people. I'm a psychologist, so there weren't so many PhD programs where they had training in how to do research on suicide. And over the past years, you're just seeing, leading figures in our field like Thomas Joyner and David Rudd and Marsh Linehan, David Jobs and others train so many students, and now those students are starting research labs, and the number of people working in this area and the creativity of the work, year after year after year, I think for me is very exciting.
If you zoom back to
Yes.
where you were,
Yes.
what was the status of becoming a suicidologist or a suicide researcher at the time?
Yeah, good question. So I started in this field. My first job out of college, volunteer as it were, was at what was called the American Suicide Foundation, now the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. So I started there as a 21-year-old, making photocopies and this kind of thing. And it was a wonderful organization, and there were a lot of amazing researchers. My impression at the time was that it was very psychiatry focused, and suicide was often talked about as an outcome of mental disorders that should be treated with medication, and the goal should be to find the genes and essentially discover the neurobiology that's going to cure this problem.
And the underlying primary mental health.
Right. Suicide is, and if you look at writing at the time, suicide is a complication of mental disorders.
Right.
Suicide is an outcome of mental disorders. 90 to 95% of people who die by suicide have a mental disorder. Therefore, that's where we need to target. What I like, and this is my own bias, my own lens as a psychologist, is I see suicide as a psychological problem that results from a person's thinking. The psychologists have been increasingly, I think, trying to understand, and this goes back to, this isn't just psychologists, this is early work by Steinman and Nuringer and others who have talked about cognitive inflexibility and psychological pain, and I see those constructs sort of being rediscovered, but people are focusing more on, well, what psychological components might be given rise to from the underlying neurobiology that are important link or important mechanism leading to suicidal behavior. So I see great value and great promise in bringing this psychological approach. I say bringing it back to life because that gives discredit to people who have been focusing on it along the way, Mark Williams and others.
They deserve credit.
Sure.
But one of the hopes I had at the Atlanta Zero Suicide Summit was that one day suicidology would be a field like a fighter pilot field, like something really cool, because it's on the edge of what we know. It is very daring. It can be dangerous in the sense that if you do anything wrong, it might backfire.
Sure.
So you need some courage.
Sure.
You need innovation. You need to be fit. You need to think very clear.
Yeah.
And I was hoping, and I think perhaps you could agree on that people like you would inspire young researchers or young students to live up to this challenge.
Yeah. Were I more of a fighter pilot type guy, I think that would be true, but I appreciate you saying that. But I agree 100%. I think it's not that I would have any influence over this, but I think it is a really exciting, interesting, and often dangerous area that keeps people away from it. There's lots of challenges involved. It's very difficult work to do, both psychologically, but also methodologically, logistically, legally. There are concerns, And I think for many years that's kept people away. That being said, and going back, I am excited, continually excited about work in our field. I also, though, get, I don't know what the right word is, frustrated that we're not doing enough. We're trying to push forward, but I feel like progress isn't happening quickly enough. The suicide rate is still the same.
Yeah.
A colleague at Duke, Kelly Brownell, who's the dean of public health policy there, and he talks about the importance of impact. And we as scientists often think about impact by what are we publishing, and what are our findings and discoveries, and how many people are citing our work. It's such a crazy way to think about it. Impact is, are we changing the suicide rate? Are we saving lives?
Yeah.
Do we have evidence that what we're doing is actually working? And so I often think of that. I get sidetracked and think about, well, it's nice we have this new finding, we have this new paper, and isn't this nice and interesting? But it's really about, are we having an impact in people's lives, really? And not just in a cliched way, but are we moving the needle?
So you make the difference between impact on yourself as a researcher.
Well, impact in the field.
And the impact on
am I pushing the
world.
science forward?
Right.
But if the science is moving forward and it's not moving over into the world to have an impact, then it just sits in a silo somewhere.
So if we imagine a rock rolling it uphill,
yes,
you know.
I'm familiar with Sisyphus's work.
Sisyphus, yeah. So this is one of my favorite metaphors.
Yeah.
So is it what you're saying that we're not pushing hard enough, or with enough people to get it onto a tipping point, a plateau that gives us new vistas, new horizons?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a nice way to think about it. Another way is, so there's that effort on our part.
Yeah.
Again, to steal a metaphor from my colleague Kelly Brownell, he talks about passing the baton. When you have, a relay race, and your job is to run as far as you can, and you pass the baton to the next person, and then they run along. We're running our leg of the race as scientists, as I think about it, and we can run faster and help people push us further, but we need to learn how to pass the baton. We need to take what we're finding. We need to have better we need to have better, more original research. We know that mental disorders predict suicide. We know that there are a lot of things that are known knowns. Let's move beyond those. That's our part. But our part is also passing the baton to think about, well, how do we translate the science? How do we, if we have a new finding or a new prediction method, how do we get that in the hands of clinicians? How do we get it in the hands of how do we get the information in the hands of people who do public policy, public change, and try and get a lot of what we know out there?
So your research on EMA, and smartphones is perhaps a translational aspect to it, which is because this would really increase the reach of what you find if you could apply it to.
That's right. So it has a potential, I think.
Yeah.
So we've been moving in our lab, moving more toward the use of new technologies and digital methods, not because it's cool and exciting and interesting, but because it's ubiquitous. Everybody has these devices already.
Yeah.
So if we can plug into the network of society and learn about suicide, better predict it, then we can, dissemination becomes easier. So rather than, my graduate advisor, Alan Kasdan, was for many years, has been throughout his career one of the leading evidence-based treatment researchers in psychology, and developed phenomenal evidence-based approaches to treating child psychopathology. He's recently pivoted and said, this is great, but this is not changing society. We need public health models. We need to find methods at scale for our prediction, but also for intervention. Again, it's us running this little race where we're trying to do one-to-one therapy, and if we get effects, that's great. That's not going to reach the majority of people who need help. So I think EMA, social media, related approaches will give us, I think, better data, more real-time data, but also a plug-in to that baton pass to say, now that we're in the network and can better predict, what can we do to start turning levers in the network to try and drive the behavior down? And we can test lots of things quickly, more efficiently. Once we find effective things, then we can spread those across the network, is the hope.
What we see in, for instance, cancer research, and is groups teaming up. Of course, they are competitors for the same amount of money, but then they decide, well, the challenge is too big for each of us, so why don't we combine? And that made they're making some really great progress on the genetics and the application of therapy. So could you imagine something happening like this? Because for me, I feel that I'm sure that most researchers around the globe value your work and Joe Franklin's work as top, as you know,
Thank you. It's nice of you to say.
Cutting edge. So, and this was the question, the $10 billion question asked in Washington. What if you would have these $10 million for say 4 years, only 4 years?
Why
What
4?
would you?
Why not 8? How about 8?
No.
20 million for 8.
20 million for 8 or whatever. You know, too much money.
15. No.
Too much money.
Yeah.
There's too much money. But what would you be? Do you think that could you come up with an experiment or a study, or perhaps 2 or 3 studies, but only 2 or 3?
Mm-hmm.
Not all these small studies doing RCT on a
Right.
small portion of this, but really robust big studies. What would be your study of choice?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot of ways I can go. I think there's a lot of ways we need to go. What I would love to see happen is this teaming up. So we've been doing small studies, focusing on EMA as an example, doing small studies where we collect data from 100 people, 150 people.
Yeah.
And we have, what I think are some interesting findings, but they're not the most interesting findings possible, because what we really want to do is be able to predict suicide attempts. And one of the unfortunate aspects of the work we do is to predict suicide attempts. We need larger samples, and we need those attempts to happen so we can get better at predicting them.
Yeah.
Not only would we be interested in teaming up, we've started the process of saying, let's formalize what it is we're doing, let's make it open source, and let's create a data use agreement and a plan for, if there are other people who are interested in doing similar work, can we team up and share these methods and have a plan, and we actually have a proposed plan in place where we can share across teams what we're interested in doing and all collect data in the same way in different sites, pool the data together, and now we have statistical power, we've got great collaboration, we've got great ideas. You know, we can do this together, and there are models for this. There's the World Health Organization World Mental Health Survey Initiative, where Ron Kessler and colleagues have data collected across 24 countries. It's a beautiful model. People got together and they all put egos aside and said, let's work together on this, pool the data. We can all write papers, but this is the way to make discoveries. This is large team science. It happens in cancer, it happens in other areas. Why can't we do the same thing here? So I think that would be, rather than say, let's take $10 million or $20 million or whatever it is and say, let's do an RCT on CBT or fish oils. That's all not going to do it. What I would love to see happen is develop a big platform, whether it's an EMA platform or some other digital platform, an infrastructure that we can then all use to make discoveries, but then we can also use to plug into. You've got an intervention, great. Let's plug it into the network and test it out. I've got one, great. You've got one, great. So I have no horse in this race. I have no Matthew Nock intervention I want to test. I want to discover why people are killing themselves and find ways, of the dozens of ways out there that people have, find the ones that are effective. Plug them into the infrastructure, test them out. Things that don't work, that's nice. Publish it, let the field know that's not effective. Find things that work. And it's not going to be any one thing, as you know. It's going to be, in a zero suicide approach, a network, a community of things that need to be done. But we need to test them one at a time, and then we need to disseminate the ones that are effective. This is nothing original. This is just, I think, we need to change the way we're doing science. And we now have the ability to do that with digital means. But we need that platform to exist.
So have steps been taken already in that direction?
We have. So we have been doing studies in local hospitals, some of which we described at AAS meeting, to say, here's how we've been collecting information on smartphones and with wearable devices. Our plan has been, we think this is an exciting area. Let's try and, all we can control right now is what we're doing. Let's move this forward. Now we have a plan in place for how this is working. We have procedures for determining level of risk and how to respond to different levels of risk. And we recently hosted a meeting with NIMH where we brought in bioethicists and legal scholars and psychiatrists and psychologists, IRB people, to say, how should we respond if we're monitoring people and say they're at risk? What steps should be taken? We have a consensus now. We'll share that. Now we've got a plan in place. Now let's share this with other colleagues and see. And we actually have a data use agreement we've been working on because several people have said, we're interested in doing something similar. Are you interested in collaborating?
Yeah.
And my answer is always yes. If it's somebody who's interested and able to do this work, then we'd love to collaborate. So we've started to take steps to scale this up. And we'd be very interested in talking to colleagues and collaborators.
Okay, that's good news. But I get the message is that research infrastructure is very important.
Yes.
To build an infrastructure that would allow for the bigger studies to happen.
Yep.
Okay. How about the funding? Is the funding sufficient for that?
Well, you have $20 million, you said.
Yeah, but
Back-
now we're back in. So
Back into reality.
back into reality.
Yeah.
But this is another. I think this is another tipping point, perhaps to be reached for governments to realize the cost of suicide on not only the emotional cost, the existential cost, the financial, the economic cost.
Yes.
These are huge,
Hmm.
and this is a disaster.
Absolutely. I agree.
It's a silent disaster because we are ashamed of talking about it. Politicians don't like it. They can only fail, they think. What would be needed in this atmosphere to reach a tipping point for politicians to reconsider and to
Jan, before we go to the politician standpoint, if we could explore just a little bit you were talking earlier, Matt, about impact.
Yes.
And you were reflecting on some of the directions you heard at the conference. So Joe and Jess both presented aspects of a four assumption sort of theory a paradigm shift actually, that they were really, I think, taking an axe to the entire tree that has supported most of the work that's been done, and very intriguingly so. How much of that are you familiar with or developed here at your lab, and what are your thoughts about some of these essentially new paradigms for new directions given the lack of impact we've made?
Yeah. I agree. I mean, these are things that we've been talking about here for years, and Joe and Jess have done a phenomenal job developing them and presenting them, and they should get all credit and ownership. There are assumptions that that we've had that, with all due respect to all existing theories from Durkheim on up to today, my own naive perception is a lot of the theories we have are overly simple, and they're sort of going for a home run, saying, here's the thing that causes suicide. No, here's the thing. No, here's the two things. No, here's the three things. There's not three things. There's not two things. Suicide, as a lot of us, I think, believe, is the result of a confluence of lots of different kind of factors. And there's many different paths to Rome. And we need to understand what kinds of general factors interact to get a person to have experience psychological pain, to get a person to think about suicide, to get a person to plan and then act on their suicidal thoughts. And it can be lots of different things. And there's lots of things that push the risk up and facilitate, and there's lots of things that push the risk down and inhibit. My own perception is it's overly narrow to say, here's the one thing. I think it's this one thing. Let's test this one thing out. One can do that, and one can test those models, but those models probably sit in a broader framework of lots of other things that predict. We here have never said, well, here's our theory of suicide. Not that there's anything wrong with that. We need theory. We can't just work crassly empirically forever. We need to start putting together variables to say, how do these things interact? What kinds of things interact? I don't think we're there yet. I think if you think back in the early stages of any field, and our field is relatively early stages, we put together sort of simple building blocks for how we think the world works. And it turns out that often the case is more complicated down the road.
So if we could expand on that a little bit, are you familiar with the complex system dynamics mathematics? Okay. You have heard about chaos theory, which was a big thing.
But I can't explain it to you here.
You can't explain it?
I cannot explain it to you here.
Well, that small things and can have big effects, given a certain degree of being out of equilibrium, then a small thing could it's like if you're kayaking or you're in an upright position and you swipe around the upright equilibrium until a point that it's tipping, and then you're upside down. So basically, the system of a person kayaking has two states, two equilibrium states, upright and down. So so we see these things, of course, happening in clinical practice. Patient is going well, and then suddenly, catastrophic depression or recovery. You know, suddenly something goes. Can't explain why, because there's only incremental changes. So you see that in clinical practice. You see that in nature, in climate changes. You see that in economics, so stock markets. You see that in public opinion. Suddenly something cool gets uncool. I noticed you have books about Malcolm Gladwell, Outliers and Blink. The tipping point is lacking.
Yeah.
He wrote about this.
Yeah.
This is the so complex system dynamics.
That one's at home.
It's no,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
beside your bed.
Yeah, I use it because I can't see my computer. So
Yeah. Okay. So at the Zero Suicide Summit in Rotterdam, one of the keynote speakers will be Professor Martin Scheffer. He's an ecologist. He's a mathematical biologist. Studies lakes, shallow lakes. So the ecology of shallow lakes. Suddenly algae bloom. Lake gets green. Suddenly. And then next day algae die. Water becomes clear. So what makes that happen? And he has been studying that. Underlying these changes is robust mathematics. So these you can model them quite well. So a complex system could be understood not by not simplified by the agents or the variables, but by the dynamics, understanding the dynamics. And he uses time series to do that. So he's doing the. So we've been talking about suicide and suicide prevention on two levels. For instance, the patient level, and then and he has been studying your papers, and he recognized.
my apologies to him
Why?
for having to read my papers.
No. He was excited.
He's okay. Okay.
He was excited.
Okay.
We have him on tape, and perhaps we could show you because he's able to. This way, we can start a scientific dialogue, perhaps. What he said is, if you use the metaphor again of Sisyphus or tipping points, he looked at your data and he said, well, it looks like something like this. So now a patient gets sad, in despair, agitated, and feeling perhaps I should kill myself. Then now here, this bump is fear of death, is the instinct of living. So this ball will oscillate. Some of these balls will flip over and they die. Most of the balls will roll back. So what he says in your data is that he sees that he could imagine that persons who are suicidal are stuck in this suicidal equilibrium. Should I not? And this equilibrium is not only based by the context in which they are living, but also by their own dynamics, their own psychology. So they move from within.
Yes.
So based on this assumption, he says, prediction, individual prediction, based on the mathematics, is not possible. You know that there will be people dying if you don't do anything. Most will not. And based on this model, he says, well, zero suicide practices, like asking people every day or every time you see them about their suicidality, is very rational, because you want to know how they oscillate, what is their amplitude. So, and basically, suicide prevention would be like safety planning, like making this dip higher, and lowering this and lowering the energy, lowering agitation. So this is what we do at 113 when we pick up the phone. We listen, people get calmer, they start, their heart rate is going down, they start thinking more clear, and then they can go on for this day, for this moment. But the nice thing about this is that
Yeah.
it is very well founded in mathematics.
Mhm.
So you need big data.
Mhm.
You need many people,
Mhm.
and you could study the micro course, so the day-to-day course, the hour-by-hour course of of suicidality, as opposed to asking it as a clinician once in 2 months, for instance.
Yeah.
So, how do you think about this?
Exactly this way. So this to me maps perfectly onto how we've been thinking about suicide for years, which is, as I mentioned earlier, there's some things that predict suicide ideation, which is this first hump, and then people sit in this place where they're deciding, are they going to act on those thoughts, and they plan, they prepare, they oscillate, they have ambivalence, and then other things predict, do they make this leap? And so I agree that this is consistent with anecdotal experience and thousands of interviews with suicidal people, and is consistent with our data so far, suggesting that some things will predict who's going to think about suicide, and other things predict who's going to act. I agree that you can draw a barrier to say, well, once people are thinking about it, we can try and prevent them from acting by doing things like safety planning, which we do, or we can decrease their motivation by targeting risk factors like agitation, which is something else we're trying to do. And so with our EMA work, we've been focusing on people who have reached into this trough here, to say once they have ideation, given our sample sizes, we can't predict who's going to go over that first hump, because then we'll have to follow people who have never thought about suicide, and we're not there yet. That's where we want to get. We'll study people who are in this trough and see what predicts who and when make suicide attempts, and let's try and target that. I would add we can also do one more thing, which is draw, if I may, try and do what you do here, up here. Are there things we can do here to decrease people from
Yeah.
Right now we're not there. We're saying, given statistical power, given logistics, we're focusing on people who are here to understand suicidal thoughts. We want to do this part to save lives, but then we want to work back to say, are there things that we can do earlier in life, earlier in a person's experience, to say, this person is starting to climb this hill. Let's target them.
Matt,
but I agree with 100% with the approach, the logic.
Can you overlay the approach that Jess and Joe are starting to put onto that? If I heard what you were saying earlier correctly, and I understand them, one of their assumptions is we're not going to find a core genetic driver from the bottom to the trough and the trough and over, and that we're also not going to find a simple set. We're going to see an indeterminate. We're going to see an equation of things that cluster together, some kind of algorithm, if you will, that yields what gets someone into the trough and what gets someone over.
Yeah.
Would you,
I think there are,
right?
Yes.
Going in the right direction?
There are. I'm trying double helix. There are genetic factors, in my view, that give rise to psychological factors that in combination, so lots of these things will give rise to these, and then lots of these things will give rise to these.
Yeah.
But there's not one of these, there's not two of these, with all due respect to my colleagues who have beautiful theories about this. There's not going to be one or two or three things. It's going to be a combination of dozens of things that can get you there. And there's going to be other things, genetic factors, psychological factors, that are related. It's not like there's a gene for this. There's clearly not. There are genetic contributors to the psychological states that will get you to suicide. So yes, we can find genetic effects of this. We can find genetic effects of this transition, but that's not going to be the whole story.
Yeah.
We can find factors, psychological pain. I think most of us would agree that's a piece of it. You can think about pain
sleeplessness.
It's going to be related to sleeplessness, and it's going to be related probably to feeling like you're a burden, or you don't belong, or you're hopeless. I mean, all these things are going to be related factors that, there are probably different types that can contribute. Things that cause you pain, things that a tendency to want to escape a situation. Well, pain and a light trigger finger for wanting to escape might be a dangerous combination. Sleeplessness might get you to feel agitated. Maybe that contributes to your psychological pain. I think about Wimsatt's causal thicket, that in trying to understand any area of science where you have complex causal relations, a thicket referring to sort of a bush. Mm-hmm. If you look at a bush, there's all kinds of vines and leaves flowing together. you can pick out one or two things that maybe can, to try and map the metaphor on, predict the shape of the bush. That's not the whole story. There's lots of different ways to slice this up. We can spend our lives saying, well, here's my 2 or 3 things that I think predict, and here's your 2 or 3 things, and they might get supported, because if there are things like depression and pain and hopelessness and burdensomeness, of course they're going to be correlated with suicidal thinking, and there's going to be other facilitators or inhibitors, fearlessness, acquired capability, access to firearms, and so on. Lots of different things that are going to push your risk up. If you're suicidal, things that are going to push your risk up or push your risk down, of course they're going to be related. But we, I think, shouldn't be looking for the 1 or 2 or 3 things. We should be looking for the classes or types of things that can push you up or down, push you up or down. And I think, I didn't see Joe and Jess's talks. I had to leave the conference.
Right.
But I know what they're thinking, and
Yeah.
I think this would be consistent. I hope this would be consistent with what they're
No, I think it is. Can I?
If not, they're wrong.
Let me be a third person to
Yes,
the board here.
please.
Let me. One thing that wasn't clear to me from either. So, let's grant all of this so far. Then the next question I'd like to get just a little feedback, Matt, is this group.
Sorry,
so,
this is from
yeah.
an earlier meeting.
So these genetic predisposing factors, which lead into these psychological factors, and the same here. You could hear that 2 different ways. You could hear it a little bit as gates you have to clear, and others as vulnerabilities. And I hear, depending on who's saying and how they're saying it, it yields both at times. But wanted to get your idea on, so this is the entirety of the world population. You could hear this as saying in there somewhere is some group that has these vulnerabilities, and so you really start with this excluded, and then this group then gets narrower as you go through these various gates, and that'd be different than a sort of a different approach. And it was just reading this, looking at this Nature article that Jan was showing me from this other professor of where he was talking about the extinction of a plankton, where the environmental impacts upon that yield a situation where it's almost assured. But up until that, you get this sort of variable. It's really hard to pin down which ones bounce over, right? So I guess this, to use a, as pain is a simple, huge simplification, but these external sorts of, as that gets more and more pressure on it, then this, the level of, as you, I guess, I don't know how to do this exactly, but the genetic, psychological sort of predisposition, as this goes up, even if this is, if this is high, if
high genetic risk.
You know what I'm saying? Even if you have low genetic risk, there, as you go up, you're starting to put more and more pressure on. I guess the question really is about, is there enough pressure that this goes beyond? Is ultimately, can anyone in our society find themselves in this trough?
Of course.
And can anyone find themselves over if
100%.
there's just enough? 100%.
100% I agree. Not 100% of the variance is
All right,
explained
so,
by what I just said.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't put pain as separate from genetics. So, and I wouldn't necessarily put external things separate from genetics.
Yeah.
You have genes can interact with your environment.
Yeah.
Right.
Genes can influence your environment
Yeah.
because you have an influence on your environment. Your environment can influence your, your epigenetics. So I think we have
It's
the
a
tendency to
confluence.
think, and there's not going to be a gate. For some things, PKU, you've got some genetic risk, and if you have this gene, you have this genetic modification, this polymorphism, you've got the outcome.
Right.
Or if you've got the genetic modification and you've got some environmental factor, diet, you've got the outcome. That's not the case for mental disorders. It's not going to be the case for suicide. I say this not with authority, just with sort of common sense. The way I think about the world as a psychologist is these genetic factors. Genes don't code for suicide. Ken Kendler has a wonderful paper called in the American Journal of Psychiatry, A Gene for ... which goes through all of it. So this is not new, this is not me, basically saying genes sometimes work this way, where they code for something in some deterministic kind of way.
Right.
That's not the case for psychiatry, for mental disorders, or certainly for suicide, which is further downstream in a more complex way. You have to have some kind of psychological pain to get to suicide. let's take that as perhaps the most given. Happy people tend not to kill themselves. If someone kills themselves, we can assume they're depressed or sad or experiencing pain in some way. You can have a genetic loading to be more predisposed to be a kind of person who's neurotic and worrying and ruminative, and there might be genetic loadings for, I'm sure there are, for different pieces of that. Those things can get you to pain. You can have no genetic loading for that and still have really horrible things happen to you as a human, and that could cause you psychological pain. So it's not that it's the genes, it's the nature or the nurture, and it's not, I think, that you have to have the genetic predisposition to have the outcome of suicide.
That's
if you have it, it's going to increase your risk. If you were born into a genetic loading, and we can measure this to some extent. I mean, there's clearly a genetic component to this. We know this from twin studies, from adoption studies. Of course, there's a genetic piece to this. But absent that genetic loading, you can still experience psychological pain. You can experience cognitive constriction, lack of flexibility, access to means, and have this confluence of factors come into play. I think of this as, we've been talking in this lab for 15 years about suicide as, thinking about it like weather, or like cancer, where it's a really horrible outcome. Like you think about tornadoes or hurricanes.
Right.
It's not the temperature that's going to do it. It's going to be a complex system of things that cause this outcome.
Yeah.
With cancer, you can have the genetic loading. There are things that you can do though to
What I would like to invite you is to Professor Scheffer. He's here on the video, and what is
Can you ask him what he thought about my papers?
Yes.
We asked him.
Oh, good.
Because he'll tell you. He'll tell you.
If you didn't like them, I don't want to see it.
No. So
I'm not a complex system. Simple system.
But to introduce him, this is him. Can
I sit on my brown leather couch when I look at it?
He's nervous.
But what he said is basically it is not the what, if it is the pain or the this or the that, what the variable is, but the variability. So how the dynamics are, that the dynamics themselves may be sort of a risk factor.
And Matt, you were talking about genes affecting about all this kind of back and forth and interchange. You're going to find that you've impacted aquatic science, and maybe he'll impact you. This is
okay.
It's cool.
No geluid.
Mathematical biologist. I study ecosystems, but over the years I've been studying more and more different complex systems, because the mathematical theory that we've been developing appears to be rather generic across complex systems. So you can think of the climate system, financial markets, psychiatry, ecosystems. So the work we've done over the past years with psychiatrists suggests that it makes a lot of sense to think of, for instance, depression in terms of a complex dynamical system and network of interactions that can bring a person across a tipping point into a state from which it's difficult to recover. It suggests that there are generic ways that we might assess the risk of such a transition. So I'm definitely interested in talking to your community about also seeing suicidal behavior and seeing the idea of the social tipping point that we might be facing in terms of looking at suicide and the possibilities of prevention of suicide. I find that very interesting.
Great, thank you very much. Now, we will be visiting Professor Matthew Nock, who's been doing some great work on time series. You've been looking at the papers. Could you share some of your associations or your thoughts on that research and possible perspectives you see?
Yeah, Matthew, I guess they're going to show you this little video. I really liked your paper on the dynamics of auto-reported mood. We did a similar analysis on auto-reported mood dynamics and found that the variance in the temporal correlation and the cross-correlation between different elements of auto-reported mood are predictive of the subjects getting into a clinical depression later in life. So your data looked really interesting to me to look at that from this perspective. One thought I also had is whether you could look at the dynamics of different elements like agitation and sadness, for instance, the probability of those peaking together in time, because I can imagine that suicidal behavior depends on this particular potentially fatal mix of both being very negative about yourself and your perspective, but also having this high energy level. So I was wondering whether that would be an interesting perspective to look at the time series to see whether persons that where this particular combination is very rare in time would be at lower risk than persons where this particular combination would be higher in time. And also just the question of the variance of the mood dynamics, the roller coaster, so to say. Is there any way of explaining the size of that variance, because the variance in itself might be a risk factor? Anyways, I love your work, and I think it's really cool to think about the system this way.
Okay, thank you, Martin.
So, this is a biologist.
Yes. A smart one, because he likes my work.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
If not, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I agree. I have a number of thoughts. I'm thinking back to two recent presentations that I did. Would it be possible to walk through one slide?
Yeah.
Of course.
Two slides?
Yeah,
course.
From two different presentations?
Yeah.
Should we pause this? And can I? Because I don't want to.
Of course.
Record. It might take
Yeah,
a second
of
to
course.
figure out.
Sure.
But
Yeah,
rather than try and
sure.
fumble through this verbally, if I can just show a quick
Yeah.
slide.
Sure.
Okay. And I don't know if I have it on my computer, my laptop.
And Jan, I wonder if you also mentioned to him about this finding that you told me about heart attacks, where the driving the wheel gives
Yeah.
that illness.
I didn't talk to that about that with Martin, but
Oh, you did?
this is a finding a time series of.
There's some weird fluid inside my screen.
Uh-oh.
Time for a new laptop. That's really weird.
Matt, is that common that you've got people from other fields who are leveraging your work, or you're leveraging, I mean, that cross-pollination
Usually it's
stuff?
us leveraging theirs. And one of the slides I want to show you is actually we have been in discussion with and just got a grant with J.P. Onella, who's a physicist by training, and Sam Gershman, who's a computational modeler, to do exactly this, to say, let's measure sort of computational phenotypes, psychological characteristics of people in an EMA study. We'll give them a task.
Right.
One of our postdocs, Alex Milner, really bright guy, developed this escape learning task, basically putting people in negative context and seeing how much they go versus no go to escape. With really exciting findings, suggesting that people who are suicidal have trouble not doing something to escape from an aversive context. Really exciting differences between suicidal and non-suicidal people. Now, can we take this? And Sam Gershman has really interesting approaches. He's a really brilliant computational modeler for pulling out different kinds of parameters, like not just tendency to want to escape, but how that changes over time, and to what extent a person attends to or weights recent trials versus distant trials. Because we tend to think about suicide, which is something that they do routinely in computational modeling. To me, this is for suicide. People have been thinking a lot about the time perspective, and people tend to get really constricted and focused on what's happening now and not what happens further out. If there's a way to model this in real time and to ping people a few times a week to have them do a task and measure these different parameters to see how are these things changing, maybe increases in the tendency to want to escape, which we can measure behaviorally, corresponding with increases in agitation, which we think are a potentially lethal combination, as was suggested. We can measure that in real time among people at risk to see, is it not just your base level at one point in time, but if these two particular things tend to be increasing. And going back to my earlier comments, it's not these two. We might be able to find, we might be able to show, might find the agitation and the tendency to desire to escape. If those increase, that increases your risk. I wouldn't then say, these are the two things. Those are two types of things.
So what Joe Franklin showed was he said there's a formula. Let's imagine x plus y equals 4. There are infinite number of solutions. This doesn't mean anything goes. It doesn't mean
Right.
we don't have a model here.
Right.
But the indeterminate complex number of infinite ways that and you're hitting on one of those.
Right, that's right.
One of those
Exactly
infinite
right.
number of ways.
But basically, I mean, what this escape how do you call it? The escape task
Mhm.
is about resilience. It is about staying adaptive, isn't it? So,
How do you mean staying adaptive?
my association with, because I was talking to Dave, if you do time series with people measuring their EKGs, you see that people get a heart attack or an infarction, their heart rate variability decreases, and so the heart just pumps like dum 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 dum, like a diesel. So it loses the bandwidth. It loses the ability to swing a little bit around the tempo, and this is maladaptive. So if you look at this study you're doing, perhaps you are trying to show that people who are in big pain and more suicidal, they don't see, they don't can their heart, their mind is not able to think of new other things.
Yes, it could be. It could be if this escape tendency ramps up, that puts you at risk. Or it could be if it ramps up and doesn't come back down, that puts you in a it gets to be too much pain and too much a desire to escape. In the same way, I think about suicide a lot, like people like panic disorder. You have a panic attack where you can start to get anxious. Maybe it's that increase maybe if you go to full panic attack and you feel like it's never going to go away, that's when people often get up and run out of the room. Or if they're giving a talk, sometimes with students, where they start to feel panicky and try and run out of the room, say no. But is it the initial increase, or is it the increase and then the persistence which leads the person to think this isn't going to go away? I need to escape.
Yeah.
I don't know. We have to collect the data to find out.
So it might be a sort of a panic feed forward. Panic causing panic.
Yes, absolutely.
So suicidality causing more suicidality.
It could be. We have a recent paper using EMA suggesting that suicidal thinking may be reinforcing. People's affect improves after thinking about suicide, which anecdotally maps onto some people saying, I was feeling really bad, and then I was reminded of the fact that I have a gun and I could kill myself, so I could get a relief if I wanted to, and that calmed me down and made me feel better.
Yeah, it's the other way.
That's like that ball bouncing back and forth.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Not there yet. Sorry. I agreeing, but
We'll stop distracting you while you're getting. Uncle, what are you thinking about this?
Yeah, I need a sheet, I think, to implement them, to import.
Matt, can you share us these slides later?
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
We can incorporate them into the...
I just love your bookshelf.
Thank you.
I have Persuasion and Healing myself. It's nice that you see that people across the globe tend to have the same kind of Bibles.
Right.
Blink.
Okay, here's one. Let's grab the other one quickly.
Hmm? Yeah.
House of Cards.
That's
Right in the middle.
That's a great one.
And
People go one of two ways on that. Some people like it, some people hate it. I thought it was a phenomenal book as a new grad student. Okay. So the first one, actually this is from a talk that I gave at a small talk, so it's one of these little talks where I think 4 people saw it. It wasn't a plenary, it was a small thing. And it was one of my favorite talks to give because It's rare that I have in my career said, here's what I think about what might cause suicide. And I presented this, and I don't know what the feedback was because there was not many people in the audience, and I've been meaning to write this up as a paper, and I haven't. So maybe this is an opportunity to share.
Terrific.
So earlier in the talk, I described what I was saying earlier about people think of suicide as an outcome of mental disorder. Now RDoC is saying, no, it's made up of potentially these different psychological components, negative affect, lack of positive affect, cognitive constriction, and so on. What I would suggest is suicide results from an interaction of dysfunctions in multiple evolutionarily adaptive domains. So why would suicide persist as an ongoing question? Well, the reason is, and I talk about causal proximity and specificity and appropriate level of explanation, some things that if you read about causality and Ken Kendler's work on patchy reductionism are relevant. But essentially, we have psychological traits that are adaptive. They keep us alive historically. We have a stress response to prepare us to act. We experience psychological pain. If you're part of a tribe and you're excluded, some alarm bell should go off saying, go back to the tribe, otherwise you're gonna die.
Yeah. Brene Brown said that yesterday exactly.
Is that right?
In her latest book.
Okay.
Yeah.
She's right. We are self-critical. We have to constantly scan ourselves and examine what we think we're doing wrong and correct it. We have to take risks. Early on, we have to go out and forage, we have to go out and hunt, and that involves taking risks. And if you don't take those risks, you're not going to be successful, you're going to die. So people who took those risks were rewarded, and we have their genes. You need to think flexibly. You can't go to the same place every day to get fruit or to get food. You've got to change those genes were passed on. We have to have prospection. We have to have the ability to imagine the future, to simulate. We are simulation machines. We need to think about what's going to happen in a certain situation, what will happen if I do X or Y. We have to have that ability. Absent that, those people who couldn't do that are no longer, their genes are no longer in the pool. We've got to be able to make good decisions. We've got to have a fear response to keep us alive, to keep us away from getting eaten by saber-toothed tigers and so on. Right. All of these things are adaptive. We have to have these things to survive. The problem may arise when, if we are, and we all have these things on a continuum, on a distribution. If we're too high on some of these, we're experience too much stress or too much psychological pain, so to speak. We're from the higher end of being extremely self-critical or taking risks, and on the low end of being flexible or being able to prospect or make decisions or have a fear response. We're fearless. Some combinations of these things will get us to think about suicide. Some others of these things may lead us to make suicide attempts. Some others of these things may make us more likely to die by suicide. It's not this one. It's not that one. It's not this one and that one. It's not even these 8. These are 8 ones that I thought of when I was putting this talk together. There's going to be dozens of these. And it's maybe if you have any of these 2 or any of these 3, it's some cocktail of things. I think this maps on to probably...
Well, this actually is more complex, but it helps me understand Joe's little formula thing a lot better.
Right. So to get to 4, you can have that one and that one. You can have these 2. You can have sort of, mix and match. Last thing. For each of these things, we have behavioral tasks, so we can measure these things in a more objective scientific way. And for some of these things, we know the underlying neurobiology, things like decision making, and we know the genetic factors that are linked with the underlying neural circuitry and neurobiology. So when John Mann says it's the genes that are involved, of course there's genes involved. How do you get from the gene to one of these steps? You've got to have the neural circuitry, so of course the brain's involved, and that might get you here, of course. But just that's not going to do. So the genes that are linked to some aspect of decision making, you can show that they're correlated. It's not going to be the whole picture. There's going to be pieces of this. So not to say the genes aren't important, or the psychology isn't important, or the behavioral tasks aren't important. Of course it's all important, but we've got to understand what genes and which neural circuitry, neurobiology, and what psychological processes, and then which combinations of these things. And again, it's not going to be one thing or 2 things or some combination. It's going to be lots of ways to get to Rome. This is not bad. This is good. This means we can look at the genetic level, we can look at the neural circuitry level, the neurobiological level, we can look at the behavioral level, and we should find out what these pathways are, but we have to understand the interaction of them. What to target? Do we target the brain? Do we target the behavior? We have to target all of it. But this is how I think about how suicidal thoughts and attempts arise. This is a complex system, and it's not going to be one of these things. It's going to be some of these things will get you up here, some of these things will get you pushed over the edge. Absolutely.
And they're interrelated.
Absolutely. So if you have pain, you're going to have trouble making decisions.
They influence each other, and they are variable in time.
Yes. Which brings me to the other slide I wanted to show you. So this is a study that we're doing. We just got funded to do it with an internal grant to do a study here at Harvard, where we're going to recruit 100 adolescents from a local psychiatric hospital, do a baseline assessment, do what we think about digital phenotyping, so a moment-by-moment quantification of their self-reports, some cognitive testing, the escape learning, decision-making task I was describing earlier, some passive and physiological monitoring. So if we take suicide as an effort to escape psychological pain, as one potential, I think, really important theory,
Right.
we can measure a person's psychological pain. Probably best at this point to measure that with self-report, because pain is although it sounds like a simple construct, is it biological, is it psychological, is it self-report? I think subjectively is the best way to measure it. Escape tendency, though, we can measure with these tasks, and not just your percent accuracy or reaction time, but this is where Alex Milner and Sam Gershman come in saying, we can pull out these computational phenotypes, and we can look at how a person on a task performs over time to see maybe at some point they can't take it anymore. And we can measure this daily over time to see to what extent my psychological pain interact with this, or to what extent my increasing the psychological pain predict how how much pain you think you're willing to take. So maybe there's mediation, maybe there's moderation, maybe there's mediated moderation, and so on. These parameters can be mechanistically interpretable. I mean, we think they might be mechanisms that explain how a person gets to suicidal thinking over time, or suicidal behavior over time. So our goal is to map these things out with EMA using self-report, using psychophysiological assessment, and then using some sort of newer, fancier modeling approaches to pull out psychological parameters of interest, like tendency to want to escape, but also tendency to be temporally myopic. That might change. And again, pulling this all together, is it one of these things increasing? No. Is it the interaction of some of these things? Sure. Probably the interactions of a lot of these things, but maybe it's if pain goes up and stays up, if this goes up and stays up, maybe. Or maybe if the pain goes up and stays up, and if this comes above a certain threshold, like water freezing, then you're in a risk state, and then once it melts, then you're out of that state.
Yeah.
We don't know.
No.
I think any theorizing is just that. It's speculation. My thought is, rather than come up with a theory and use deductive reasoning to try and test that theory out, or test out different pieces of that theory, valuable way to go. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. What we're putting our money on is more inductive. Let's get the data and test out different models, because we probably haven't thought of the right combination yet, or the right interactions yet. Let's look and see what the data tell us, and then test it out and make sure it replicates. But I think we've got to have, it helps to have the data first. And it's going to be an interaction of the two. Mm-hmm. We are injecting our own ideas here by looking at escape learning, because the patients, people tell us, and people have been telling others for years, studies for decades, where one interviews people who just made a suicide attempt and survived. Why did you make the attempt? 3/4 of people say, I wanted to escape some psychological pain, some situation, some humiliation. So it stands to reason that we should focus on escape. But that's not going to be the only thing. Some people, there are going to be lots of different pieces to this. But this is how we're thinking about it. There's lots of different pieces that come into play. It's going to be a complex system, and that system changes over time. So let's pick what we think are going to be the most important pieces of this overall model, knowing that they're just placeholders for related constructs, and let's measure them over time and see, can we capture how their dynamic changes lead to suicidal thinking. And if we can get a large enough network of people doing similar approaches, then we can start having enough power to say, well, what predicts actual suicide attempts?
Wow. I mean, how different is this? This gives the suicidal process a face, a heart, legs, arms. So much better than the statistical association studies, risk factor. Sure. This is really something, and it is happening at your lab and on other labs. So this is I believe
a paradigm shift.
A paradigm shift.
Without a doubt.
And finally, looking at the real stuff. I mean, what is suicidal behavior?
Right.
So.
And then you choose your language differently, right? You're using escape because it allows that more complex environment of factors. I mean, it's changing the way you're talking about.
So,
Yeah.
Am I right on that, Matt, or not?
And it's well, people talk about suicide. People who engage in suicidal behavior talk about suicide as escape. Since I started in this field, I thought about how can we behaviorally capture what that means. I often have thought about, since I was working at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, suicide attempt as, what is a psychological proxy for that? It's sort of like escaping in a burning room. And I've heard people use this language to say, I didn't want to die, I just couldn't be in that room anymore. I didn't think I could survive in that room, so I wanted to escape. Can we come up with some kind of task that captures that feeling like you want to escape, or that actual behavior to escape the room, so to speak?
So let's go with that for a moment. You were talking about freezing water earlier, and I was thinking about somebody who's at 33 degrees. And again, you would talk about time and things, it's not totally fixed on an individual person, but at 33 is really cold, but really in no danger of cataclysmic freezing unless something forces it to drop.
Sure.
But that burning room in Thomas,
and you can get it to freeze different ways. You can put some shade on it, take the dark sun away.
Right.
You can blow some cold air on it.
I'm assuming gravity and what pressure, but so the burning room for a minute. You use that as a metaphor. So Thomas, in Why People Die by Suicide, he gives himself an out on the burning room he says it's terrorism when the people jumped from the towers and not suicide. And I've always said, wow, okay, so the whole book you talk about it's a universal theory, and then you give yourself an out on these people. Yes, the building caught on fire from the plane and all, but they're in that room. They come in with no intentionality of ending their lives that day. And I don't know if anybody's looked at what actually happened in that room, how much time they had, were they physically forced out?
I don't know, now.
That metaphor, that we actually have some scenarios where that's happened, right? Or at least in that one.
Yeah.
Where, and I don't know if we know of people who didn't jump, who were there in the room with them and were found.
Right.
Do you have any...
No, I think there's no... It's an interesting, what I might think of as a thought experiment. Is it the people who jumped from the Twin Towers, was there some random sample of people and some jumped and some didn't? Or was it just the people who jumped happened to be caught in a bad place, the wrong place at the wrong time, and there was nothing else? Either you got burned or you died from smoke inhalation or you jumped, which is how I always thought about it, that it wasn't... It's interesting to think, was there some choice involved in tolerance of the flames and smoke versus jumping? I've always thought of it as more... Instead, I think about the burning room as a psychological metaphor for what people experience, that it's this sort of... Marshall has talked about getting through suicidal crisis as climbing a metal ladder out of hell.
I've heard talk about
that. It's tough to get through it, but you escape by tolerating it. But it's a sort of burning metaphor that people, there's something that I really feel like I can't tolerate, and it's not going to go away. If I think that burning is not going to go away, I have no choice but to jump. And I jump when I feel like I just can't take it anymore. Either I'm going to die by smoke inhalation,
No, that's
or I jump.
exactly the way I think about it when I think of those rooms.
And one of our graduate students, Osiris Rankin, is doing his master's thesis on sort of the psychology of method choice. And maybe for some people, and we'll have data on this very soon, jumping to one's death is preferable to smoke inhalation or immolation, which are not pleasant ways to die.
Right.
I've always thought of people who jumped from the Twin Towers as people who died by suicide, because technically speaking, they jumped to their own death. I don't think there's value in studying those people through psychological autopsy as a way to help us understand suicide more generally, because this is an extremely unusual situation where people could be completely happy and healthy and 10 minutes later had no desire to die by suicide and wouldn't were it not for this extreme environmental event.
Right.
Whether we call those homicides or suicides, I think culturally, societally, people want to call those homicides because of this fact.
Of course.
But I think that is a concrete expression of what I think of as the metaphor for.
For me, though, it's an example of this here, that actually under enough pressure.
That's right. Right.
And probably we weren't there, but probably everyone who had some out is forced, by the impending pain and out that window.
You talked in the beginning, in the start of the interview, about handing the baton.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I've been in suicide prevention for 25 years now as a psychiatrist, and I was never taught any good model except for really, abstract models. Even the Rory O'Connor's model is still not telling a story. It is just descriptive.
Right.
Now, a thing like that, or what you just showed,
right.
the evolutionary instinctive tasks we have to perform in order to survive or to escape pain. These are stories that can stick, because only since I think a few months I started thinking of suicidality in this way or in that way. Would it be feasible, and would it be okay for you to take responsibility for knowing what you know, and also not knowing what you don't know yet? To, for instance, make cartoons or animations to inform clinicians about where the field is at right now.
Yeah.
So ways to think about suicidality, which is so much more understandable than the abstract models we have, or the stigmas, or the stereotypes we used to have for people at risk of suicide.
Yeah.
So how do we increase? How do you reach your audience? The audience being society, but also the clinicians that have to work with these patients.
Yeah.
They need some stories. They need some narratives that make them that make them feel comfortable enough and daring enough, and also disciplined enough to implement what we know that works.
Yeah. It's a great question. I don't know the answer because I am guilty of not knowing how to best pass the baton. I've been focused on trying, how can we better do the science? How can we better understand this problem? How can we think of ways that can inform theory? I come back to the work of my colleague Kelly Brownell, who's at Duke University, who's written a lot, and he's got papers in New England Journal of Medicine and The Lancet on this in the past few years about the idea of doing strategic science, of saying, let's figure out who the decision makers are and why they're making the decisions they're making. He's written about this in the areas of eating and obesity, sugar-sweetened beverages, and so on. What should we do to try and... We know that there's health implications to what we're doing right now. We know there's a better way to do what's happening in society. How do we do it? We can, as scientists, say, well, I have an idea of how we should do it, and do that. Or, what Kelly would say is, go to the people involved. And there's the people, that's policymakers, that's clinicians, that's public health professionals, that's people in corporate America, and let's figure out, well, why are they making the decisions they're making? Why aren't they doing X, Y, or Z? Why do we have the suicide? Why don't we have zero suicide everywhere? Well, maybe if we go to the government or we go to healthcare companies, they'll say, well, because why would we have this? What if we had cost-effectiveness analyses showing if you implemented this, not only here's how many lives would be saved, here's how much money you would save in the process. Crassly economic as that is, maybe that's the decision that's driving system A, B, or C. If we now know that, now we know strategic science-wise, now we know what we have to do. We have 2, and in a few months we'll have 2 additional postdocs funded through MSRC, the U.S. Military Suicide Research Consortium. This is collaboratively with our lab, Ron Kessler, Thomas Joyner, and Pete Gutierrez. And Thomas and Pete generously provided funding for this. These 4 postdocs, their primary job is to do cost-effectiveness analyses around suicide, to see what does suicide cost, what cost-benefit change would we have if we implemented intervention program A or B or C.
Yeah.
Armed with that, maybe now we can say, look, system A, B, or C, if you changed in this way, here's the savings not only in lives, but to change it financially for society, for your healthcare network, or your organization, or whatever the case is. So I think we need to think, I don't know what the answers are.
Okay.
I think we need to think strategically and work with people who do know how to solve those problems.
But there is also a non-scientific way that is common.
That's my specialty.
Yeah, no. But if we go outside, we are surrounded with advertisers.
Yeah.
These are people. They were able to sell ideas, stuff, reasons to buy things.
So Jan, you're talking about that. For me, you're talking about the innovation diffusion curve, back to tipping points.
Yeah.
Where are we right now? If the if the innovation is that, let's take a little bit of what I heard at the conference from Craig Bryan, from Joe, from you, from others. Craig called it stupidity, but Joe went much
stupid.
Joe went much further, and he showed a tree with all the theories being the branches, and he said he didn't show an axe to the tree, but that's what he did. He said we need a new tree trunk, we need a new assumption. If the new assumption is something in the ballpark of genetics is not going to determine this whole thing, it's much more complex than we've seen it. There's more of a narrative that fits people's stories. If that's the innovation to a new paradigm that's got to emerge, where are we on that innovation curve? How many people are out there thinking that way? Where do you see us, Matt? Are we anywhere near a tipping point?
For whom? For scientists?
For scientists. Because before we get, if the scientists are all in disagreement, it's hard for us to begin to impact the law.
Well,
but where are we with the science behind this? Are you a very early adopter with your team, or where are we? Where do you see I know it's a judgment question, but I'm not putting it in the terms of who's right and who's wrong. In that new paradigm, where is that in terms of getting to a tipping point in the field?
That's a great question. I think perhaps foolishly and naively have thought about, well, how can we move things forward? What work should we be doing? What assumptions are we making about how people get to suicide? And I've had my assumptions and haven't really written about these. I think just because I always think, I don't know if it's poor theory of mind, or I think, well, who cares what I think about this? I'm gonna keep doing the work that I'm doing. So I don't know. I don't know. Reading work of people in the field for years, again, Nuringer, Schneidman, others. I always thought that a lot of people think this way, that there's not one thing or two things or three things, it's just confluence of things. There is an increasing amount of sentiment and I think an overemphasis on theory, and I hate to say, I shouldn't say that because I think theory is of course incredibly important, but an overemphasis on which of the available theories are you adhering to and following, which it assumes itself, we've got it. Mission accomplished, we found the theory for suicide. Mm-hmm. I have seen an increasing sort of proliferation of work saying, and I've had funding agencies say to me when I present stuff like this, well, which theory is this? Is this theory is Smith's or Jones or O'Connor? I was trying to make up a name, but I said O'Connor or Mackenzie. Royce's very wonderful theory. Well, it's none of them. It's. I don't think we're there yet. So I don't know. Are we at a tipping point where people are realizing now that there's value to going more bottom up and saying we shouldn't have these silos and say which theory or is it genetics or not? To me, that's as myopic as anything. I think it's all, of course, all these factors are at play. I think we should start at the bottom up. Is it a paradigm? Yeah, the paradigm shift maps onto the the U.S. DSM and RDoC shift to say we understand mental disorders because we can write down symptoms and get good integrated reliability on saying these are mental disorders. Yeah. But when we map those onto genes and neurobiology, they don't work. So there is a paradigm shift there to say, well, let's have a new, and this came from the research diagnostic criteria, which was actually the foundation of DSM years ago, to say let's create a research domain criteria. The research diagnostic criteria helped us have greater reliability. The research domain criteria is presumably going to help us have better validity. It's a similar thing, I think, to what's happening to this discussion, which is we thought we had it nailed, and because we had good findings, we had good reliability with DSM. The theories we have now, we can show statistically that these things do predict. The shift to RDoC, the shift to the slide I showed was from actually a presentation about RDoC and its relevance for suicide and suicide theory. It's the same in terms of starting at more bottom up and saying all of the levels of analysis are of course important, but we need to look at the more basic ingredients, the more basic components, and think about what combinations can get us there. So it's a long-winded way of answering your short question, which is I think there is more of a shift over the past years in psychiatry and psychology in general, and maybe this is part of it now, to say, going back to my earlier statement, when I first started in this field, it was suicide is an outcome of mental disorder. That's a theory in a way, not very explanatory, but it's a model of, it's a way of thinking about relationships among variables.
Yeah.
Similarly, we have now simple psychological theories. This is more of an RDoC, and I think what Joe and Jess are saying is more of an RDoC. It's let's start at the basic ingredients and work up and acknowledge that it's not going to be one of these things. It's going to be some combination of these things.
Yeah.
So to the extent that that movement, that paradigm shift in the field moves into the suicide research, I think all the better.
But of course, what David says is true, that the scientific community and experts, scientific researchers, experts, are very important for clinicians, because they look at how is the field evolving, what is.
Some do.
Yeah.
Not all of them.
I know. So there are two sides to this. So the one side is of clinicians being able or willing to adapt and to use new insights, new findings, implementation. But on the other hand, storytelling by these researchers. So I was wondering, listening to you, because I'm so excited about just these two slides you showed, and this simple model. This
well, you drew that.
Yeah, but this is a simple
now you're
metaphor.
just bragging.
Yeah. No, but
I know I'm like that.
they match.
Yes, they do.
So,
they do.
I was thinking, how do we translate your research findings and your questions also, your unknowns?
Yeah.
We don't know yet, but into simple, into language that could be well digested by science, by clinicians and by society.
Yeah. It's a great question. It's one, I've thought about a little bit over the years, but admittedly not a lot. There's a group here at Harvard who's done work in this area on exactly this. And the idea is science is a silo, and clinical work can be a silo, and policy is its own silo, and never the groups shall meet. And this group said, well, we need to start making that. It's our responsibility to make that translation, and to go to Washington, D.C. and say, well, here's what the science is showing us. And this group I'm thinking of actually worked with people in marketing to say, how can we communicate this better? We can't go and say, well, if you have a genetic predisposition and have some later environmental insult, this increases your predisposition to experience. They said, no. Toxic stress. We'll call it toxic stress. Early environmental factors can lead to this stress that can be bad for you health-wise. And toxic stress, as a term, scientists say, well, that's kind of vague and oversimplified version of what's happening scientifically. But people understand toxic stress in a way policymakers can understand it. Certain environmental factors can lead certain kinds of people to experience bad outcomes. It's a toxic environment. Rather than blaming the person or blaming the environment, we now have some kind of palatable, digestible.
Yeah.
We can do the same for suicide research and
what would be your slogan? What would be your motto?
I have to think about it. Just give us more money. I'm kidding.
Yeah.
I don't know. It depends. This group didn't just come up with toxic stress. They had
if
meetings and discussions. So where do we want to focus?
Look at the zero suicide. We don't accept suicide any longer. What are your feelings about? Because this is a way of framing suicide and suicide prevention. That suicide is until the last moment preventable, which is counter to what many people think.
And we've talked about this polarity throughout this discussion today. Zero suicide is an aspiration pushing this way.
Right.
But also, as you comment on that, because you also comment, we perceive a fatalism that we've seen in the field. It's certainly medical and psychiatry and behavioral health, but even in research, base rates of suicide that kind of... Can you reflect on a little bit of that, the fatalism that do you agree with that we've had a certain fatalism in the field?
How do you mean?
A certain expectation that, the way that I was... the story that comes out for us that's behind zero suicide is that Henry Ford Health System makes this application for the Institute for Healthcare Improvement grant. And they make the finals. They have an oral review with Dr. Don Berwick. He comes in, and they have a plan to gradually improve I can't remember if they were using a depression inventory. And he said to them that, he thought it was probably revolutionary in behavioral health to be actually quantifying and charting progress. This is 20 years ago now. This is probably good work in behavioral health. But he said this is not what the perfect care, never events,
It's not transformative.
high reliability. This is not what we're looking for.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I encourage you to go back and think about that. So he goes back, the team is just sort of brainstorming out loud, frustrated with what he meant by that. And a nurse is speaking and says, well, I guess if we provided perfect depression care, we wouldn't have any suicides. The psychiatrist in the room stands up and says, well, that just doesn't make any sense. If someone's going to kill themselves, they're going to kill themselves. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in clinical practice, and it seems like we had not a very narrow sort of, water freezing right here,
mm-hmm.
but a much broader, and once you entered that, there was no turning back kind
mm-hmm.
of. That's certainly language I've heard from clinicians
Gotcha.
and medical professionals over
Yeah.
the course of decades. And is that also permeating in the science and the research background, or maybe not?
For some, I think it's. What do I know about what's in the mind of others? For some, I'm sure it does, and I've heard this from people saying, "Oh, you're trying to build a statistical model to predict suicide. That's dumb. That's impossible. There's no way to do it. We shouldn't try. People are going to get, and I think embedded in that, implicit in that, is this fatalistic approach that people. There's different ways to think about it. There's the statistical. The models aren't going to work unless you have X, Y, or Z. Well, let's get X, Y, or Z, because the alternative is we do nothing. And some people say, well, there's nothing we could have done to prevent that suicide. Maybe, in some cases, maybe that's true. And I've heard of a handful of cases where a person was suicidal and in the hospital. This was discussed at a conference I was at. Is it ever okay to let a person die by suicide? Well, maybe in the rare case we've tried every single possible thing and the person's not getting better. At some point, you say, well, there's nothing else we can do. It's inhumane to keep this person locked up in a hospital. That's very, very, very rare case. In my 20 whatever years of doing this, I've heard of 2 of those cases. I personally don't accept that. I think I flash back in my mind to 100 years ago, 200 years ago, when people said the human body is just too complex. The circulatory system, whatever that is, how could we ever possibly understand that? Right. The heart, how could we ever understand that? We don't have the tools, we don't have the understanding. It's in the body. How can we ever look at it? But here we are. I think in suicide, we're at that stage where we were 100 years ago with other aspects of human nature. We don't understand it. We can throw our hands up and say, we'll never understand the heart. We'll never understand the circulatory system. Or we can say, well, how do we get better? What's the next step? It's not going to have a home run where we say, I have a theory of how the heart and the circulatory system work, which is where we are now. But let's get in there. Let's see, is there a way to look inside the body, to look inside the heart, to measure it, to have stethoscopes, to look, right. To look at people who have passed away and study their circulatory system. So my own bias, it's easier to be fatalistic. It's easier 100 years ago to say, there's just nothing we can do, let's keep doing what we're doing. Or we can say, well, if we're ever going to stop heart disease, whatever that is, we need to get inside the body, get inside the system and understand it. And I think that's how I think about suicide research and prevention. We can, prevention-wise, do what we know now how to do, but we have to keep hitting on the science to say, well, we're not there understanding-wise. It's not that we understand suicide, and if we only did X, Y, or Z, we can prevent it. If we do X, Y, or Z, we probably can drive the rate down. But until we fully understand it and can better predict it and prevent it, we're not going to do as much as we can possibly do. We're not going to reach our potential. So I think both are important. And again, it's the baton again. Yeah. The science is important. We've got to keep improving, and we've got to be more creative, and we've got to put more funding into it. But we have to make the translation, and we have to do more in prevention.
How's your feeling about zero suicide? Just is it a helpful concept?
I think so. I'm in favor of zero suicide. I'm against the opposite. I like that it is aggressively aspirational. Dispositionally, I'm a little bit of to use some DSM terms, oppositional attention deficit, occasionally hypomanic, especially with enough coffee kind of person. I don't like complacency, and it's easy. I think about research and clinical work, all of us, and I'm a researcher and a clinician, and somebody who aspires to hopefully push more on policy. I don't like the toiling away. I have a colleague who thinks about people who sort of toil away and punch the clock as just you're doing work. You're doing farming. You're just sort of going in, you're punching the clock, you're turning the wheel. yes, you're doing stuff, but you know, the meter's not moving. We can do that. We can keep doing work and publishing papers and seeing patients and doing what we're doing. That to me is complacent. People are dying. One of my best friends killed himself a few weeks ago.
I'm so sorry to hear.
Thank you. It's a reminder of this is happening. I mean, it's happening to all of. We all have people who continue to be at risk. Many of us continue to be at risk. It's happening, and to me, those of us who are privileged to work in this field have a responsibility to move us forward. And to just keep doing the same little thing over and over again is maddening. So I think zero suicide it's aspirational, it's aggressive, but we have to move the needle, and it holds us to account to say we could be there. Yeah, we're not going to be there next year. We're not, and I'll spoil the surprise. But we've got to get beyond what we're doing. We've got to break out of the molds we're in, and we've got to acknowledge that what we're doing is insufficient. We've got to push forward on all of these fronts. It's
what you said earlier. You said, I want to make an impact. Impact factor? The impact factor is beginning to make an impact.
And I'm as guilty of this as anyone. I think about, well, what is the impact of the journal I'm submitting to, and this paper is going to be good for so-and-so's career, my career. Of course, that's the world we're living in. But it's important to also remind ourselves of the fact that people that we all know are killing themselves, and we are all at risk, and our kids are all at risk, and our spouses and our parents are at risk. So this is not just sort of theoretical academic stuff. This is cancer. This is you use a fighter pilot. I often think of what we do as oncology. People will say, "Well, what you're doing, it seems like really depressing work." It can be, but people are dying. Thank God there are oncologists who are trying to understand cancer and trying to improve treatments because all of us are at risk for cancer.
Thank you.
So all of us are at risk for suicide. So someone's got to do this. Someone's got to try and cure the cancer of the psychological and psychiatric world. Not to say that suicide is a cancer, but it's taking lives.
Yeah.
And oncologists aren't going to figure out suicide. They're not focused on it. They're smart, but this isn't what they're focused on. This is for psychology and for psychiatry to figure out. Yeah. And so we've got to do a better job of this.
I think it is a cancer, and I think you are our fighter pilot, isn't he?
That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said.
Thumbs up. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for what you're doing.
Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Wow.